So welcome to Asian Dramaturgs Network. Many of you are familiar with ADN, have been there from the beginning, and some of you are new to it. So very briefly, ADN began in 2016 when founding director Lim Hao Nhan, who's here with us, started a series of symposia, meetings, workshops, conferences to think about what this thing, the dramaturg, is and what is dramaturgical thinking in the Asia Pacific. Since then, we've had these various events, and thanks to Center 42, who is our host in our home, these events were all documented. They are available online as well on the website, and you'll see videos of all the various discussions and symposia. And then they were transcribed, and from that material, we felt it was important to mine what was available and put together these 3 volumes, ADN Review, Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, of which a team of co-editors, myself, Daniel Teo, Daniel Wave, Chongwa Ki, Wave, and Dominic Na, who's not here because he's at class this evening. We looked through the material, we worked on it in different ways, and we produced these 3 online publications with a very cooperative, delightful, inspired, and patient designer, Huang Su Huai, who took on our crazy ideas and worked with us and was very patient with change of mind, asking for a little bit more. And we really want to say a big thank you to Su Huai for working with us on this. So as part of these online publication events, as it were, since ADN has not been able to meet for the last 2.5 years, the last time we met was in 2019, when we had a conference as part of the Singapore International Festival of Art. We've had online discussions. So we had one after Volume 1 and one after Volume 2. And this one is after Volume 3, which came out last month. But we're not just looking at Volume 3, we're looking more holistically in a way at this idea of the publication, online publication, and what it means to make resources available, what it means to build resources. And we're very glad to have 2 guests who are very much part of ADN, but guests for today in that they will provide stirring discussion for us to then take on and discuss with as well. And that is Janet Pillay and David Pledger. I will introduce them more fully in a minute. Both of them have contributed to ADN Review very significantly. In Volume 2, Janet's keynote from 2019 is featured and published. And in Volume 3, David's keynote from 2018 in Adelaide is also published. David, of course, is featured also in Volume 1 and Volume 2 because he has been part of the ADN discussions since 2016. And so his notion of operating systems, for example, comes up in Volume 1, and then concentric circles and other things comes up in Volume 3. Before I go on to introducing our 2 guests in more detail, I want to just say a little bit about the structure of today's online discussion, so you have a sense of what's coming up and how we'd like to invite you to participate and be part of this discussion. So for the first 20 minutes, I'm going to be talking with David and Janet about their views on ADN, all 3 volumes or a particular volume, depending on what they choose to talk about, and ideas about publication and developing resources for dramaturgy in the Asia Pacific. And then we open the dialogue for everyone to participate. And so we're not calling it a Q&A specifically, because it's not about question and answer in that sense, but more really inviting your perspective. Some of you have read some of ADN perhaps, ADN Review perhaps, or been to ADN events, or have your own experiences in relation to dramaturgy or dramaturgs. And then after that, we go on to the second part of the discussion where I'll talk with David and Janet about their own provocations for dramaturgical thinking and dramaturgy in their current practice at the moment, what they're thinking about, what they're doing, and ideas maybe about how this can inform approaches to a pandemic or endemic related performance making and thinking, or both of them have been talking about cultural dramaturgy, social dramaturgy, political dramaturgy almost, And then from there, we move on to another open dialogue. So there are, in a sense, two phases of the dialogue, both of which involve space for you to participate. Now, another dimension is the chat function, which everyone has access to, will also be used as a space for you to comment on. And Kwaki and Danielle will provide provocations. Sometimes they will put you onto links if they feel those are relevant. And you're welcome to use that as well. If you think of a project or an idea, please use the chat as well, because that becomes a resource and a way for people to engage while some conversation is going on. And then we wrap up and we go from there, and we hope that works for you. Okay, so let me start by now getting into the discussion, and first introducing Janet and David a little bit more in detail for those of you who don't already know them. Janet Pillay is a researcher, scholar, and arts practitioner in Malaysia whose interests lie in the field of arts and culture education, as well as research and publication. And Janet has worked for most of her career as a young people's theatre director, focused on collaborative and integrated arts processes, before moving into community-based arts and cultural sustainability. She's a member of Five Arts Centre Malaysia, and there are many other Five Arts people here today, I'm happy to say, a dynamic collective of artists, activists, and producers dedicated to generating alternative art forms and images in the contemporary arts landscape. Janet began her career in the teaching and practice of children's theatre in the 1970s, and I was one of those children. Her pioneering work involved collaborations with Malaysian performing artists and the young participants, resulting in more than 25 major productions and an online resource that I would ask you to look at, because it's a really exciting resource, called Arts Education Archive Malaysia. In 2007, Janet founded Arts Ed, a non-profit organization in Penang, which provides place-based culture education for young people. And while in Penang, Janet served as associate professor at the Department of Performing Arts in University Science Malaysia until 2013. Now she is an independent researcher and consultant in the area of cultural mapping, community engagement, and arts and culture education. Her work entails research, training, programming with varied organizations and institutions from universities, NGOs, local government agencies, artists and planners, people who are interested in community engaged projects and place revitalization through the arts. She's authored 5 books, numerous articles on arts, culture, and heritage education and cultural mapping, and contributes as an expert resource person in regional organizations such as UNESCO Bangkok and APCI EU Korea. That's Janet Pillay. Well, that's some of Janet Pillay. David Pledger, is an award-winning contemporary artist, curator, producer, writer, thinker, who works within and between the performing, visual, and media arts in Australia, Asia, and Europe. And his live performances, installations, interactive artworks, documentaries, digital art, ideas, and discursive events have been presented in books, journals, magazines, as well as museums, galleries, art centers, as well as a city car park, an abandoned stables, a suburban house, hotels in Surfers Paradise, a Slovenian film studio, and the Australian Institute of Sport. His views on tennis you can ask him about later. His work is notable for engaging publics in productive and provocative ways, and from his initial practice, which is live performance, he's developed cross-disciplinary dramaturgy in which a central platform is primarily about engaging with artists across art forms and working with experts from social, scientific, academic, and philanthropic fields. And his keynote alludes to some of this in Volume 3, if you've read it. So the practice interests include the body, the politics of power, the digital realm, and public space. He is founding artistic director of a company called Not Yet It's Difficult, NYID, which is one of Australia's seminal interdisciplinary arts outfits. And his current projects include David Pledger is running for office 2016 and ongoing. It's a serial performance work contesting the space between artists and public office, which if you haven't seen any of, I'd encourage you to look at what's available online. He's a recipient of very many awards, grants, commissions, and his curatorial practice focuses on creating these optimal conditions for artistic production that generate provocative questions. It's currently curator of something called Anat Spectra 2022 Multiplicity, which is an artistic and discursive platform inspired by the intersection of art, science, and technology, which you might talk about later. That's David Pledger, part of David Pledger. Welcome to you as well. Okay, so let's get the conversation going. Thank you both for being willing to respond to ADN review. And so without further ado, that's what I'm going to ask you to do. And maybe we'll start with David and then move on to Janet. Your thoughts on ADN review and how you read it, what you thought of, what you think of it, and what else you think it might lead on to. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Charlene. Lovely to be here in this Zoom room with everybody and see some familiar faces and I haven't seen for a long time in person. I should say I am zooming in from the on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation here in the city of Naarm, Melbourne, Australia, and I acknowledge and pay my respects to elders, present, emerging, and future. Yeah, I think one of the things that I feel that when I look at the 3 volumes of the ADN review, firstly, I think I hadn't seen it before. I hadn't seen something like that before, where there was such a comprehensive trajectory about the concept, the philosophy, the culture and politics and artistic dimensions of dramaturgy. And I think that's absolutely desperately needed. I am refreshed and always have been by the work of ADN and reminded by it when I look through the review of the kind of positioning of the whole project in Asia, and acknowledging that in some of the works, I think in one of the editorial notes, the whole idea of Asia and being Asian is constantly questioned. And I think I wouldn't even say it's a gap. I think actually what's interesting is that, dramaturgy has really been sort of so Eurocentric that so many of the conversations that are needed to be had have not been able to be had. And so the idea that it's porous and fluid and contested and unresolved and evolving is present through the 3 volumes. And so what it feels to me is, and I want to make a little point in a second about this, but what it feels to me is that there's a new provocation in play around the ideas, and that those provocations are born out of cultural and artistic and political dimensions. I often feel at the moment that art has either been, is either one of 2 things. It's either a tool or a product. And my feeling is that, so it's a tool because it's often instrumentalized through government policy. And it's a product because it's been commercialized through a kind of overriding financial system that is steeped in reducing everything to a financial unit. And this is part of the neoliberal project. What art is to me at its most subversive at the moment is process, because process is very, very difficult to concretize. You can't turn it into a commodity, because the minute you kind of grab it and try to get your hands on it, it sort of disappears on you straight away. So it's very hard to make something of it that you can kind of sell or turn into a tool. And so when I was going through the 3 volumes, I sort of was reminded that actually in the way in which those volumes are constructed, the whole thing's a process, and that there's a strong dramaturgy in the editorial approach that takes me past the 3rd volume into a whole set of questions, which I think is fundamental for any dramaturgical process, that you develop a better set of questions than the one that you started with. And for me, that's where I get to at the end of the 3rd volume. I get to a better set of questions than the ones we all started with 5 years ago.
Thank you, David. it's so true with what you're saying about the process of these volumes, because earlier I was saying that we couldn't have gotten to volume 3 without volume 1 and 2. And we found our way through, and this is the team of co-editors, by having those conversations and trying things out. And once volume 1 came out, it had a particular presence, and they kind of spoke to us in a particular way, and then it moved on from there. Volume 1, of course, was focused on the idea of mapping, which informed the main title of the first ADN event, and then volume 2 was tracing, and volume 3 was framing. And these are, of course, processes familiar to people involved in dramaturgical thinking and to dramaturgs. But yeah, this idea of publication as a process is something I think that we can return to in a bit. But I'm going to turn now to Janet. Janet, your responses, please.
Yeah, I was a bit overwhelmed reading this heavy 3 e-zines, which I kind of like pick and choose, throughout the year. I was just looking at particular articles or particular sections of it, but to read all 3 was really heavy. And it for me, what was exciting, I think, about the 3 volumes was that it actually it gives you a very expansionary view of dramaturgy, because it covers so many dimensions and contexts in terms of language, culture, geography, disciplines, different professionals within the performing arts, talking, even different works, from the point of view of different works that were performed. So I think it's only when you overlay all these articles, which was somehow or other achieved to some extent by the annotation, in the e-volume. So the annotations were, whether they were little comments or, a reflective statement or Q&A by some panel. It was one kind of overlay which really helped you to kind of contextualize what you're reading, or even look for some kind of disagreement or resistance or some nodal connection. But I think because when you read the 3 e-zines together, you actually get a kind of what we call in cultural mapping overlay. So we kind of map different layers of a space, and then we overlay it, the geographical maps on the baseline map. And it's the overlay that actually reveals that dramaturgy is, it reveals a very lateral and expansionary understanding of dramaturgy, so that we don't see dramaturgy as something that is so easily boxed. It's not so easily boxed. There's no one definition. And I think it's really important that ADN keeps this very lateral view of dramaturgy. How will you retain and not let academics start to define it clearly, or, and I think one of the reasons why, because this project actually went over a few years, and it's interesting that the people who spoke and their ages was also very revealing. I mean, the people who talked about dramaturgy, whether they were performers or famous directors or whatever, I think that even the historical approach to their historical approach and their histories, to dramaturgy was really different. And I think that, was it Rustam who mentioned that it's such an evolving art, that the socio-political context of your theatre practice actually makes you look at dramaturgy differently or practice it differently. So I think the form of theatre, the socio-historical context of theatre, as it changes, and depending on which kind of practice you're in, or who was your guru, you actually have a different view or different way of using dramaturgy. And that for me was interesting, reading all the many people who were talking about dramaturgy. The other thing that was that interested me was people giving names to dramaturgy. So I use words like dialogical, participatory, then David used words like artistic, cultural, social dramaturgy, and then there's Daniel's, quantum, time travel, gravitational dramaturgy. And I think these words are very important because they allow the practitioner to reflect, have a reflection on what is dramaturgy by giving it a name by which they understand it. And this kind of diversity of understanding of the term is very interesting for me. Having been in academia for a long time, I'm really not into this kind of, no more of, giving things a kind of a very clear, four-sided kind of definition. I was also, because I wasn't sure whether ADN wanted to really focus on performance, as in the performative arts, because there was a bit of deviation into dramaturgy outside of the arts. There was mention of it. Most of it was in the performing arts. But I was also curious why there were no references to visual artists, or even more to other forms of art. And that's something I would have wanted to see more in the 3 reviews. But maybe that the intention was to focus on that. But the reason why I say this is because to the dramaturgy of performance is a very 3D kind of, art. Framing, and to frame it, to actually frame dramaturgy for an ensemble is really tough. But when a visual artist is working by themselves with a computer or something, if it's a graphic artist, dramaturgy becomes a completely different, it takes on a different kind of trajectory, a different kind of process. So I was just curious about, although there was a lot of mention of working with technology, but I'll come to that in a while. It's just not the same. Working in a 2D and a 3D is very different. Working in performance with human bodies is really different from working with, other forms of visual arts, or even music that is interfaced with technology. So that's kind of different. And I wanted to see more of that, I thought. I was very interested in these, some of the key, do we think it may, all the articles actually, especially by the keynote speakers, and sometimes by reviewers, about the importance of structure. So they use words like architecture, skeleton, David's term, operating systems. This kind of architecture, which is required in dramaturgy to create a discursive space for dialogue or for discussion or for argument, is very interesting for me, because I'm thinking about dramaturgy outside of the arts, where as a politician or as a social butterfly, I want to dramaturge, my performance, and actually I don't really create my own structure. I'm using a kind of a social structure to do it. And that structure, not structure, I'm using a kind of a, how do I say, the people who are calling the shots is actually the public. Whereas in a lot of the articles, there was mentioned that the seed comes actually from the artist rather than from the public. And I found that interesting. And this made me think of, David, your idea of concentric circles, like who is at the center? Is it the public, calling the shots, and then the dramaturg starts working, or is it the public that calls the shot? So this movement from center to periphery back to center, and I think Daniel's mention of the sun and the
galaxy.
and the system, right? The system. And how important is that gravitational pull that holds the micro and the macro together? Because I'm very interested in micro dramaturgy and then macro dramaturgy, but it also can refer to personal or artist versus public. It can also refer to, how we move, in terms of the limitations of the human body, and then the amazing permutations of technology. So how do we navigate this micro macro kind of view? And I think all the three zines actually make you think about this movement that you have to constantly navigate between the micro and the macro. I think, other than that, I think we're all familiar with, when I read about, all the skills that were mentioned in 3 e-zines by different people, it's such a kind art, it's like, words like research, observe, listen, call and answer, be sensitive to interpersonal, intrapersonal, transcultural, be democratic, it's such a lovely kind of a process, which is really an antithesis to the mad, capitalist, world out there. I will say later, I will talk later about, capitalism and how, David, I know you're very interested in algorithms and, how we use them in different ways, but we'll talk about that later. Yeah. So that's my take from reading the 3 zines.
Yeah.
It's really a rich hodgepodge of stuff. If I can make just one critique,
please do.
I couldn't tell the difference between framing, tracing, and
mapping.
I just couldn't.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you very much. There's a lot there for us to think about and respond to. I think first I will say that in Janet's keynote, she talks about this relationship between microdramaturgy and macrodramaturgy and the importance of context very specifically. But also in her presentation, which isn't available in the e-zine, her final slide was of the politician, of Malaysia's former prime minister and his wife, and how he stages himself in relation to this notion of a populist view and this question of the public and thing came up. David, I'm going to ask you to respond because I think a lot of that kind of is looking at some of the concepts that you're working with and refer to you directly. So, David.
Yes, so very interesting. I think the one thing that really kind of caught me is that whole idea of personal to the public, and I started getting this this sort of constellation of images of different shapes and because I always think of a dramaturgy for each project as having a particular shape, and I try to find the shape. I need to find the shape, because if I can find the shape of it, then I can explain the kinetics of it. And if I can explain the kinetics of it, then I can talk about momentum. And I think momentum is the key to making any project alive. And then, it allows you to find, it allows you the structure, the architecture, the codes to find what you might be looking for. So that was that kind of really tweaked a few things for me. One of the things that I'm very interested in is this whole idea of curation in this process, because a lot of my work at the moment is curatorial, and I've sort of been very interested in that space. I've been working as a curator for a long time, but I don't come from a traditional background of curating. In fact, I really don't come from a traditional background of anything. And so it sort of suits me to be a curator, because a curator is a bit of It seems to me to be a blank canvas that you might fill. Saying that, one of the things that I've started to think about curation is, and it relates a bit to what Janet was saying about, where's the audience in these processes, and that if I've got these constellation of shapes of various dramaturgies that are kind of in the universe, and I look at mine, I think what I feel like when I kind of put a program together with all the elements of concept, of people, of ideas, and the kind of alchemy of those things. For me, curation is the art of disappearing. So when I think about these concentric circles, it starts with me, and then what happens is, and if I'm any good, what happens is that a kind of an autonomous self-generating system is created, and the distribution of power in the process of creation is broad. And then there's this underlying ambition to adjust the operating system, the dramaturgy of this project for the benefit of the world, for the benefit of the many. So it's not heroic, it's post. It actually, and I think in some ways, and I've thought about this in, sort of pedagogical frameworks as well, I've always found that the best teachers are the ones who make themselves redundant. And I think, the process of curation and developing a dramaturgy for an event, which is what I do quite a bit, is actually making myself redundant in that process, to disappear. So then the thing has a life of its own. And again, I'm reminded of a beautiful lesson that I was taught by a Yugambeh elder, which is in the southeast part of Queensland. And Kyle Slab is his name. And he taught me in one of my projects, in one of my curatorial projects, he said, only give knowledge to those that you know will understand and respect it. And so that's sort of been a guiding principle in terms of who I collaborate with. So a project that I've got at the moment, I've got a curatorial circle around me, and I absolutely trust them with any knowledge that I might have, that they will respect it and transform it. And I think in that process, the one who begins the process can then quite rightfully disappear or become redundant, or see the thing being taken on. And in that way, it reflects something of what I think is in one of Daniel's, in the editorial note to number 2, I think, which Charlene's written, which really reflects around this whole idea of the democratic, and that actually power, influence is best experienced when it is distributed widely and wisely. And so then when you get through, then when you sort of understand how you might do that as an artist who is who has the departure point for a project, for a process, that's when the whole question of the public becomes much easier to understand, because actually what you're creating in those concentric circles is an ever-increasing set of publics.
Interesting how the ways in which these architectural images, these structural references become, as you were saying, either starting points which disappear, while in other instances they become defining, and restrictive. So a lot really depends on how one is using these terms, right? So Janet raised this question of how when words are offered, they can become either part of a hodgepodge, part of an assemblage, part of interrelated lateral relationship, or they can become very insistent and imposing, I suppose, and everything else on the spectrum. And what's interesting, listening to what both of you are saying about the dramaturgies of ADN review and therefore the thinking that went into ADN, is this kind of overlay. I mean, thanks, Janet, for that reference to mapping overlay in cultural mapping, and actually a way in which things kind of bleed into each other, one on top of the other, or, you know, in that overlap. But also, as dramaturg, sometimes one is doing that, providing a kind of layer of response, of question, of interaction, of historical research or whatever. And then one is also semi-disappearing. You know, this absence, presence, listening, responding kind of dynamic is at work a lot. And I think the challenge to understand what that means in a current context, something we'll come to a little bit later on, where the pandemic endemic situation means our regular modes of being present, absence have also changed. So then how do we take some of this dramaturgical thinking and work with it a little bit further? Janet, do you have any immediate responses before I open up to the wider group? Because some of what David was saying about the public, I think in relation to what you were talking about in not just the macro dramaturgy, but how context really matters. I mean, what is the public in context really makes a big difference.
You know, I'm kind of interested in our current historical period and why the public matters so much. So, you know, it's a response, of course, that we have lost power. You know, the public has completely lost power. So when Baruka mentions that, you know, how the dramaturg comes out in this historical period is a reaction to the fact that we have lost power, and we have to create architectural systems that actually make us who could be powerful, make ourselves less powerful and give more room to the public. Or we can look at the conditions of society, or ask the public to talk about the conditions of their society, and then think of dramaturging something that addresses those conditions. So I think, yeah, I'd rather keep that big picture of dramaturgy will change according to the needs of the political pressures, you know, that we are feeling, or the social pressures that we are undergoing. And we provide that alternative, I think. I mean, dramaturgy is a process that allows you to move, react or respond to that historical issue, that historical milieu.
Reminds me, in terms of this becoming redundant or becoming invisible, of a nice essay by the philosopher Jacques Rancière called The Ignorant Schoolmaster, in which there is this challenge to the notion of what is good pedagogy, and whose ignorances are being exploited in a certain kind of imposition, and what happens when that is reversed and the responsibility is, you know, thrown back in a different way, and the role that one plays. Of course, the ignorance is a kind of performative ignorance in a way, rather than you know, a willful ignorance. What happens then, of course, juxtaposing those two words together in a particular historical space also makes a difference. I want to open up now to responses from all of you, either in the chat or just raise your hand and we'll ask you to speak. It can be a question, it can be a comment, it can be something that sparked interest in you that you'd like Janet or David to clarify, or any other responses really. So we invite you to think about that. But before that happens, I'm going to direct a question directly to Han Yan, who's right here. With regards to what Janet was saying about why we didn't have more visual artists and people from that realm, right? Because I think that that's something I would like to hear from you, about, Aunyan, because there was dance dramaturgy and eventually there was a little bit of veering away from just theatre. But yeah, please talk about that a bit, Aunyan.
First of all, thank you, David and Janet. It was a very enlightening and actually very good to hear that there was just so much going on with what we've been doing, or what the editors have been doing with the review. Just to go back to the question of why not involving visual artists, I would say that probably it is a top-down thing, meaning that because I was doing a lot of the proposals for convening of the panels and the discussions and the symposiums, I could only first draw from my own experience, and that experience was steeped in performance. In my later years, it was dance, but before that, it was theatre. And so that was always the first step for me. And then when we got into a few years later, where we were trying to be more experimental or bold, or however you want to describe, ambitious, actually, we went into social and political already. There was always this thought at the back of my head, okay, so are we not going to tackle the idea of visual arts curation? But that was also because of my, again, I would say due to my own limitations in one of knowing actually the visual arts world. And in my head, dramaturgy and curation, especially visual arts and performing arts, dramaturgy, visual arts curation, the visual arts curatorial drive seemed to be always to do with works, collective works in an exhibition space or a show of some sort. The word show was always there for whatever reason. So when it came to looking at visual artists, I was very uncertain how to then actually frame. How would a visual artist go about producing, I would say, a body of works for a show, as opposed to curators, visual arts curators, and the approach where there is space, there is architecture, as Janet puts it. And that was always what I saw, but I couldn't see beyond the individual visual artist who also dramaturged her body of works for a particular project, if you know what I mean. And that was, I guess, in a way, some sort of hurdle for me. Until today, I'm still not sure how to approach that. And actually, from what Jen has been saying, it's sort of solidified what I've been thinking about. The fact that this thing about overlaying, density, that could be a way in, actually, of maybe we should start having conversation with visual artists. We started a little bit with Jompet, if you remember, she was the one that was in our latest conference, where he is actually a true blue visual artist, co-opted into the performance community because of his sculptural works, his installations that were then used for set designs in performances. So that could be a start. And it could be the future of different ADN iterations. I will definitely admit there is hesitation and perhaps, like I said, it's limitation of what I know. Having said that, there is just so much to even know within the performing arts realm that I think ADN still has a lot to explore, but we bleed out and bleed in. We recede, we overlap into the visual arts world. And also on a very personal level, when I speak to visual artists, they are very fiercely protective of their world, of creation, of criticality. And I remember when I first moved to the idea of dramaturgy or talking about dramaturgy to some of my visual arts friends in Singapore, they would just look at me and go, isn't that another word for curation? Have you been looking at, critical art theory? I think that's where it all came from. So I'm also a bit resistant that way towards that. Here we are saying that we are expanding, we're becoming quite inclusive, right? In the language we use and how we describe dramaturgy. I do find that in visual arts, the discipline of critical art theory is very steeped in and locked in that kind of academia that Janet was talking about just now.
Thanks, Sonyan. I think, yeah, these questions about how far the dramaturgical spheres or circles extend and interconnect and overlap. Daniel highlighted one of the things we said in our editorial was that might we invite chefs and neurologists and marine biologists and shamanic healers, to participate in future dialogues, because these intelligences emerge in our conversations, whether we like it or not, and they are part of how we interact. But how comfortable do we become, or how willing are we to be uncomfortable with the languages, therefore? And of course, language is a huge one, with not just the question of different disciplines, but literally different languages, the access to people and what they're thinking based on the languages we do and do not speak, or are willing to speak and unwilling to speak, or feel fearful of speaking or hearing even, might become the questions that we need to ask as well. Are there any questions?
Sorry,
Yes,
can
you
I
have.
just
Yes.
one more remark? And I
Yes.
just keep thinking about what Janet said about the public directing the performance, and that linking to quite a few times there was mention of architecture, right? For me, that could be another way in where we look at actually design and architecture.
Yeah.
I have a dear friend who is an architect, and whenever I talk to him about buildings, it's not just buildings, right? Because who inhabits the buildings? The people. And there are two major types of buildings that we know of. One are the private residences, and the ones made for public. And it's very interesting listening to him talk about designing public buildings, because before anything is done, but to be fair, even in residential buildings, right? Private residential buildings, it's always, what's it for? Who are the people inhabiting it? It's always for the people. And then there is this very detailed mapping, actually, of a choreographic exercise of how people are using the space in different spaces, not just inhabiting and using it, but moving from one space to another. We always think that architects dream up these designs first, but actually it goes back to the people. When I talk to Ian, my architect friend, he's always talking about, okay, who is living there? How are they using it? Who are the people? What ages are we talking about? Are there physical disabilities we have to take into consideration for? And if it's public, what kind of public are we talking about? And it goes into actually social, cultural, and political realms of these communities whom they are designing for. And for me, that is even more interesting, I feel. And I feel that there's something there about architecture, design, industrial design, that perhaps they actually have a wider sense of how dramaturgy actually works.
Yeah. I'm gonna ask if there are other questions. Anyone else who would like to make a comment or question? Because I know not everyone's got their cameras on, but you might want to just unmute yourself and ask a question. No? Okay, then I'm gonna pick up on this idea of how reading ADN review and developing ways of thinking about resources, materials, spaces, frameworks, platforms, to encourage more questions, because both Janet and David said very heartening things about ADN review, which is that you end up thinking of better questions than when you began. And it leads to a curiosity about the things that are not there, right? Rather than trying to be definitive, it's trying to work with this mixture of material and see how they relate to each other. And I guess I wanted to ask you both about this process of developing materials, developing resources, not necessarily in the form of publication that is limited to print, obviously, but what kinds of spaces, platforms, avenues should we be thinking about, can we be thinking about, that exceed the usual book, journal kind of ways of presenting, particularly now that we have more resources available to us in terms of not just technology, in terms of the online technology, but perhaps avenues of 3D type things, right? If we're thinking about the architecture of a city and mapping, we're having to think beyond 2D and 3D and maybe even 4D. Janet, David, thoughts about resources, materials, how to make the discourses more available?
Yeah, I'm a bit skeptical about books nowadays. It's okay. I'm a bit skeptical about how books are written. And how things are presented in this academic kind of thing. So that's why I thought the ADN format, the whole thing, annotations, overlay, comments, drawing lines that connect notes and all, is a kind of a democratic, way of presenting a very lateral view of dramaturgy. I'm just curious whether it needs, whether it should be kind of brought to I think going that way is good. So maybe when you're looking at resources, maybe that's how the resources should go, like in a very rhizomic way, giving birth to new plants and all that, and that's how the internet works. I feel maybe the internet works well because of that, but we also don't want people to get latched to a rhizome. I'm only interested in dance dramaturgy and I'm only interested in this particular view. So I think the more difficult thing is how to get people to look at that wide view of what you are producing right now from your mapping. And I think what Khao Nhan mentioned about allowing the difficult conversation with visual artists about, is curation after all not dramaturgy, to also be, to open up these new conversations, because maybe we are in the age of conversations rather than in the age of theorizing and coming up with certain principles about certain things, because I think the internet has changed the notion of theory. So we may have to look at different ways in which we present resources now, and opening up dangerous conversations or prickly conversations with people without having to worry about it.
I suppose one of the things that I'm curious about is, I love that thing in the that Daniel's just put up about, will we invite chefs, neurologists, marine biologists? I personally, I like that sort of trajectory out of artistic practice, always keeping in mind artistic practice and taking the language of artistic practice into those other spaces. I really like that, and I want to put a coda on this that says that means there's a certain amount of work that needs to be done when you do that, which is to always have those propositions led by artistic conversations, so that you don't instrumentalize it. You don't basically say, hey, what I was saying before, you don't, oh, here's a process. What do the neurologists think about it? I think that's, we really don't want to be going down that path at all, because they're just, that tree is already dead. Okay, so plenty of people have tried that, and I see it in the work I'm doing at the moment. I just see arts get stymied by, going into other spaces outside the arts, unless at the center of each step they take, there is the condition that you must talk about the intrinsic value of the art. Because if you lose that, then you're sort of doing, I don't know, an architecture project and a design project, and you're doing a science project and a technology project. You just kind of going, yeah, so it's artistic because we got an artist involved. That happens all the time, and we have to be very careful about that. I took my PhD from the School of Architecture and Design. When I was in that school, I talked a lot about dramaturgy, and most people understood exactly what I was. No, most people understood the territory that I was covering when I was talking about dramaturgy, especially when I would turn it to using ideas like operating systems, concentric circles. These are kind of graphic visual ideas. They're kind of, they're algorithmic. They speak to the algorithmic. They each touch on different parts of the human mind, and to a degree the emotional landscape of the human. And so, in that way, I feel like that is where the natural sort of movement is for the ADN project, is to actually allow itself to go into those spaces, and at some point we will meet the visual arts. But it doesn't need to be core to what the project is. But I think the project's already begun, and it's already started, it's already on its way. And at some point along the way, it might be around the visual arts. And, I understand the comparison between curation and dramaturgy. I think they're different things because of what because I think that they're different, certainly different operating systems. I won't get too bogged down in that one. I think so for me, I think it's a bit yes and. So yes, a book. I don't mind books. I love a book. I really do love a book. I love having that thing in my hand so I can turn the pages. I just love that so much. It's one of the most beautiful things for me to be able to. I learn differently from a book than I do from online. But I think there's a yes, a book, and what else do we do? And I think there are so many possibilities around things like, multimedia essay, commissioning multimedia essays out of, one part of the archive that's already there, the sort of the ADN story that's already there. I like the kind of graphic interface, all the annotations that Janet was talking about. I love the editorial notes that sort of they're like contrapuntal sort of offerings when you get to your, I'm reading the editorial notes while I'm, checking to see that I make sense in my keynote and go, oh, that's, I get that. Oh, I understand myself better now that somebody's sort of explaining it this way and they've kind of moved it around there. I like I feel like there's a sort of already a three-dimensionality in that process that you've begun. And so I would encourage you to continue with that as a sort of as a methodology, as a frame, as an image to work with. And in that, you can dive into certain parts of it and pull it out, and they can exist in different ways. I don't want to kind of, propose too much right now, because I really would like to think more deeply about what it might be. So I could put plenty of dumb ideas out there for you, but I won't do that today. But I think that the way in which it is building is provocative, and it's not like a book about dramaturgy that I've seen before, which, you know, I don't get through because I sort of fall asleep because there's the same thing said over and over. What I like about what's been offered up in those 3 volumes is there are multiple points of entry. And I really like that. And I like it that they don't all agree with each other and they don't all make sense and they're all asking a different set of things and somebody's riffing off one line that's been picked up over here. I like that because what it does for me is, and I think it's really important in this world that we live in, it's sort of brain dancing. You know, and I love that kind of experience of brain dancing when I'm reading something and things don't make sense. And I really think at its basis level, dramaturgy should not make sense.
It's illicit is another word that you've used.
Yeah,
so you know, the illicit part of it, and blurry was another word that used earlier. But this idea of brain dancing, Daniel has kindly put some of the ways in which we have played with the transcripts, annotations, arrows, other directional symbols, drawing sketches, and finally the editorial notes span the entire volume. I just should say that we are now we, meaning ADN, is going to move on into an ADN book project. And it will be a book. Some of us still love books. I still love books. I still have a partiality to books, no question about it. But what is involved in this book is going to be discussed as well. Peter Eckersall and I will co-edit, and we have a team of what I would call bookmakers at the moment, because we don't know what this book is going to be about. It will draw from ADN Review. The co-editors are involved as well. But it's also a question as to what do we want this book to be, and how will this book find a way to be and to participate in what's going on. Daniel Guaki, do you want to say anything about ADN Review and your experience of being in it as well? Because you've contributed in different ways. Guaki, the last volume, you were dealing with drawings and literally kind of manipulating the space very differently, while Daniel took off into the galactic space as well. Daniel Guaki, can I invite you to jump in and respond? They're waiting for each other. Daniel, go first.
Well, for me, I think that's one of the things that especially with documenting the proceedings of ADN over the years, is that how wide and varied the discussions have been and how they've neatly and not so neatly connected to other fields and disciplines. And I remember we had a little bit of a critique where we were perhaps exploring dramaturgy to the point where we were crossing and blurring and losing conceptual boundaries. But I find also that I really do like the idea, David, about brain dancing, and I like the idea of, instead of moving towards making distinctions and differentiating things, that we look for similarities and connections. And I think that's what ADN does really well, even in places where people think connections may not exist. It's just a roundabout way of me saying that I made my connections into space and and the cosmos in this volume. Whether it's people agree with it or not, it's just an experiment. You know, we can just try it out. And if the frames do kind of align quite nicely across different disciplines, and then I think there's even more opportunity to go into that other discipline or other field of knowledge that we've not ventured to before, and to see how it in reverse applies back into performance. And then we might gain new insights in that way. So imagine now if we looked at astrology in space and then how this applies into performance now. It's like, oh wow, maybe now we can talk about, I think if you look at the way I've written it, if you look at time traveling and use that frame in performance, it's just like, oh, okay, let's see how this works. But again, it's just about creating connections and opportunities to broaden knowledge and, more importantly, to connect people that we never thought could connect. Okay, anyway, yes. Gwaki, over to you.
Thanks. I think my mind is going back to something that we brought up at the end of volume 1, where we kind of proposed a framing of ourselves as editors, as dramaturgs instead, right? They were kind of dramaturging the text. And I think that kind of approach really pulled through the 3 volumes, where we're trying to, in our own ways, understand the logic and structure and arguments that were being put forth by the different speakers. And I think part of what I found really interesting is also that we're grappling with these across time, right? That we're not grappling with these ideas at the moment at which the keynote or the panels were happening. We're kind of looking at it in retrospect. And on top of that, we're not even looking at the conferences chronologically. Like we're in each volume, we're kind of pulling things from different years, from different events, and the kind of like juxtaposition of each other, of these different ideas was also something that I think Charlene was tending to. And I think the idea of what is interesting to recirculate and what things do we want to contrast with each other is something that I'm curious to think about more in the ADN book, right? That like now that we've really done some of those juxtapositions, how much deeper do we want to go into those juxtapositions, or what new things do we want to, sorry, sounds of the road, I don't know if you all can hear it. But yeah, like what are the new things that are now emerging, definitely around technology, right? The discourse now is so different from when, from the panel that was looked at for volume 3, and how do we grapple with the fact that by the time the ADN book is out, it will also be a thing of the past, right? That the conversation will have moved on since then. I'm still also thinking about what Janet, you're saying about it. You can't really tell the difference between like mapping and tracing and framing. And I wonder if in a way they were more like internal logics and internal structures that the team created ourselves, right? And it's okay that it's invisible to the reader in the same way that the dramaturgy of a piece doesn't have to be immediately visible to the audience for there to have a sense of a logic or have a sense of the flow across them. Yeah, but I think just generally feeling like there is already a conversation that's happening across the 3 volumes. And what kinds of other prickly pears do we want to put out there with the ADN book? Yeah.
Yeah, especially in the age of prickly conversation. I like that phrase. It's not just the age of conversation, but the age of prickly conversation. Marion, you've appeared. Do you have a question?
No, I have a couple of comments.
Yeah.
First of all, I didn't get a chance to read the 3rd one. I'm sorry, but the last couple of weeks has been kind of full on with work. But I found the first 2 zines very, very, very useful, like extremely useful for me, especially because I'm kind of new to the dramaturgy as a formal art or discipline, and also because for the first time in my career, late, I'm 68, so first time late in my career, I am working formally and informally at the same time with a real live dramaturg on on the project that I'm working on. So it's it all kind of came together. So it's been very useful and very exciting lah. So I'm actually looking forward to reading the 3rd zine. So that's the first point.
Before you continue, can I just interrupt to give a little bit of perspective? When Marion talked about the first volume, because she was at the first volume online discussion, she talked about how she printed the first volume and she wrote on it, a lot of conteng, which is the Malay word for kind of like scribble. And whether she realized it or not, I think we kind of took off with Chonteng in volume 2 and volume 3. So, you know, talk about an audience or a participant or a public kind of responding and kind of feeding this notion. So that, thank you, Marion, for that. I just wanted to point that out to you and to the others as well. Yeah, sorry, your second comment.
Yeah, reading Zine 2 was not so much fun because I didn't print it out.
You
and
didn't
my
Chonteng.
Yeah, I didn't Chonteng. I had to Chonteng in my head. And Zine 1 with all the Chonteng is now with Anne James, who is reading it, and poor thing, you know, she has to then focus on, okay, why did she Chonteng here? Why did she underline here? You know, like.
But that's
so anyway.
overlaying. Now we know what it is. It's overlaying mapping.
Right. And on the first point, you know, the real life dramaturg whom I'm working with is Charlene. So that's another story. The second point was what Janet said, the age of conversations and prickly conversations. Yeah, I like that too very much. I feel in the last 2 years, I have learned more from conversations, whether formal or informal, than I have learned from anything else. So I like that idea of conversations and how that might find its way into the future of ADN and into the book. And my third point would be, I think it would be interesting to have a messy book. I'm not sure what I mean by messy, but so, you know, it goes beyond Chonteng, but a messy book. And I was then thinking about, okay, what is the most interesting book I've recently read and I'm still reading is a graphic novel called Brazen, Rebel Ladies Who Rock the World by Penelope Bagiu. It's an amazing book and it's a graphic novel. So then I'm suddenly thinking, okay, if the book could be messy and there could be parts of it which are like a graphic novel, I don't know, because I feel, you know, dramaturgy is so messy in that way. It has so many sort of branches and, you know, what we call in Malay, cerita ranting, right? So you have the main spine, which is dramaturgy, and then you have all the different, like Janet said, you know, what people are calling it, and all these different tributaries that kind of go out. So yeah, so that would be my sort of points. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next part of our dialogue, which is to ask Janet and David to talk about perhaps some provocations from dramaturgical thinking or dramaturgy that emerge from their current practice, which we haven't asked them about. And that doesn't necessarily mean performance making, but whatever it is they're involved in, that then informs the way these ideas are emerging and links to the contemporary space in which we are trying to make sense of, as well as offer some kind of structural cohesion, as well as play with the mess that exists. So yeah, can we move on to that? Janet or David, anyone? Janet, you are unmuted, so I'll ask you first.
Okay, because I'm very interested in working with communities, working with the public, and I think David too, in his long-term project, is actually doing that. For me, I'm a bit in a state of panic about dramaturgy because I kind of have this weird fear, I would call it a fear, that, you know, dramaturgy plays a very important part in social mobilization now. And the capitalists have embraced the environment of hypermedia, and they actually media, there's a media, how do you pronounce it? A mediatization of culture that is happening. And that's really scary. I really feel as theater people, we are like really lagging somewhere. And so they can compose and present culture to you, you know, in 2D, and they're using, of course, algorithmic dramaturgy to orchestrate structures for engagement, for response from the public. So they can steer choices, they can steer action, through their algorithmic dramaturgy. So I'm beginning to ask questions like, when I work with the public, in community engaged arts, or community-based arts, or even slightly political kind of events, or social political. That means in a kind of a intersection where social, political, and aesthetics are coming together. We are like babies, because our systems, our operational systems, we are just starting to think in terms of operational systems. Like dramaturgy, that's a good word for, to use for dramaturgy. So has our dramaturgy actually, are we thinking operational systems? Or are we stuck in a very, aesthetic type of dramaturgy, or an artistic? So how can our artistic dramaturgy move in tandem with cultural dramaturgy, with social dramaturgy? And that, that's where I'm, as a practitioner in community-based arts, or socially engaged arts, I'm kind of worried about how we're going to grow this area of dramaturgy, where all the the aesthetic, the cultural and the social dramaturgy can move simultaneously and have a kind of a impact on at a macro scale. What kind of alternatives can we provide actually if they're going at such a rapid rate? What's the alternative?
Yeah, big questions, and I guess questioning the way in which we even think about the process, right? One is the assumptions about the process, and then what we do with the process. David.
Yeah, well, look, I've been thinking about a lot of that stuff for a long time now. I love the way that you framed all that, Janet. That's really super, and I kind of think it encapsulates the problem that live performance has been facing for the turn of the century, really. I'll pick that turn of the century. It's been going on for a long 20, 30 years, because there's been a sort of a shedding of live performance and the art, and the sort of attenuations of live performance from art, from society for the last 30 years, as the mediatization of the world has kind of made our lives determined by a very new DNA. And so I would like to propose how it might be done. And I think the might be's, I think there needs to be many, many attempts by many, many artists and many, many cultural operators to do this. And because this really was a problem that I faced last year with the event that I'm curating at the moment, which is called Multiplicity, which is this sort of intersection of art, science and technology. And it was initially a live event. I was going to go on in December of last year, a 3-day event. And, people were going to come from all around Australia, and there was 5 parts to the program. One part was an Assembly for the Future, which is an online gathering of artists and technologists and scientists, general public. The second was an exhibition, a visual arts exhibition. The third was a live performance program. The fourth was an academic symposium, and the fifth was a moving image program. Actually, I shouldn't say is, because that is still the frame of that project. And the reason why it was interested in this kind of fractal or rhizomatic approach to developing this program really comes out of this sort of idea of concentric circles of dramaturgy, where I look at what the sort of the artistic dramaturgy and then the cultural dramaturgy, and what I would call the dramaturgy, the social, to sort of distinguish it from that phrase social dramaturgy, which is not what I mean when I'm talking about the dramaturgy of the social. So in thinking about that and having built projects around those three sort of spaces where they both, they sort of resonate outwards, but they overlap, and they kind of operate as vectors as well. So they kind of, they sort of shift like tectonic plates a little bit. I was faced with the problem that the event was going to be cancelled because of the pandemic. So what did that mean? I mean, it was a problem that faced everybody around the world. And so I think what I thought that this was actually an opportunity, because in Australia, we have had this sort of phrase that, it's when we're going to go back to business as usual. Well, that's just a kind of a farce. There is no business as usual. We've now moved to a whole different kind of world. And that world is very much an opportunity for exactly the moment that you're talking about, because what it asks us to do as people that work in the arts, whether or not it's live performance or the visual arts, is it asks us to develop a new field of aesthetics where it's not live or online, but it's both. There is that those spaces collapse, and that the language of one can be brought into the language of the other. And so rather than seeing the kind of that hypermedia of the capitalism as being an obstacle, which it definitely is, not just an obstacle, it's a barrier, but actually looking at what it is, because we created those elements, those aesthetics. We created them through the whole story of the arts before technology appropriated all of those things. So what do we already know in that space? Well, we know a lot of things about affect. We know a lot of things about the relationship between the three-dimensional or the live and the two-dimensional. And so I started to develop a program whereby these five elements, these five kind of elements which all spoke to each other, I've recalibrated the whole thing as a limited series event. So it's like a television series. And there's 5 episodes in the television series. The first one is an Assembly for the Future, live from Planet City 2029. It's an online digital gathering with people from around the world, led by an artist, responded to by artists and scientists and technologists, and then developed and generating 10 artworks. The second one is an online exhibition, which is then sort of previewed by interviews with the artists. The third is a symposium called 36 Ideas to While Away the Winter. And the fourth is a moving image program called Future Culture, which is Indigenous Futures. And so each of those elements then are present in the, kind of internet, let's call it the internet. I quite love that word. It sounds so old-fashioned, the internet. I do like it. And all of the elements in there are then, so that's like that's the rhizomatic thing. This is happening in this sort of horizontal structure online. I tip all of these elements and they trickle down into this sort of vertically trickle down into this live event, which is the final episode, which happens over 3 days. So all of the elements, the symposium, the live performance, so the symposium, the assembly, the exhibition component are then added to and cohered with a live performance program that makes the whole event performative. And so what I wanted to try and do is to take the opportunity of to take this problem as being an opportunity and think, well, we just have to start from scratch. We can't write another book. Those days, you can write a book and you have to do all these other things. We have to think about the way in which we conceptualize and make and create our artworks and the world of art in a way that we haven't done before. And what I am doing with this program is one small, modest attempt to develop and contribute to a field of aesthetics that I think is going to be very significant over the next sort of 10, 20 years.
Yeah, thanks, David and Janet, because I think this challenge of the imagination, right, to really acknowledge the thought leadership that is involved, because it is artistic leadership, thought leadership that takes on that responsibility of challenging, but also then inventing and producing, creating, responding to, with that sense of opportunity and the sense of crisis, which is very often seen as stultifying in one sense. You know, if you have a crisis, it's supposed to be stultifying, but it's not supposed to be stultifying if the imagination is seeking ways to engage. And also, I think the ethics of it is emerging in what you're talking about, where there is responsibility in the use of resources, particularly now when resources are scarce and inequity is growing. So then what are the privileges we assume, and what is our accountability and responsibility to that? I think that is part of the dramaturgical thinking. And what you said, David, about we created the story. So the story, the narratives that are being perpetuated and that are overwhelming and that are being believed, I mean, to such a dangerous degree now, not just because there is fake news, but because the mythifying is a dangerous mythifying, and one that is manipulative via mediatization, but also via very conscious, I mean, the bots are doing it, but it's very conscious in the amount of resources available for that. If I can ask you both to then now say a little bit about the ethics and the leadership that's involved, because very often the artist is not seen as leader. The artist is not seen as the ethical role model in a way, unfortunately. And yet a lot of work is about raising these questions and grappling with these truths, untruths, injustices, and what to do about them, the dilemma, the conflict, the pain, but also the opportunity.
Yeah. Janet, do you want to go? Sorry.
No, sorry, I was just going to mention that in Zine 3, when I was reading what the producers had to say, I just felt that they were so curtailed by the system, you know, the whole funding system and the whole the state, and you know, even spaces, etc. But yet they were talking about, we want to make this alternative space. We want to make it, but they can't free themselves from this the pressure of resources, of having to work with resources. And I think, David, when you because as long as we are tied to resources and we feel that we need resources to move, I think the paradigm is wrong already. I feel that, you know, because the other world, I want to call them the other world, the capitalist world, the commercial world, they are actually fighting to control resources, as in material resources. And if artists cannot think beyond material resources, then we're never going to be free, and we're never going to develop this alternative paradigm.
Yeah, I really agree with you. I mean, I think that's one of the experiences I've had during the last couple of years in the pandemic is going online has really freed me of having to deal with venues, presenters, institutions. Most things are much more on my own terms, or on the terms of the collaborating group that I work with, and the strength of that is in the networks that everybody brings to that space. the one project we did which was an Assembly for the Future project, I mean, it had a reach of 350,000 people, got published in, I don't know how many different books and articles and magazines. And it was largely it was a small budget, comparatively, but the reach was absolutely enormous. And the other thing that I found really to be profoundly moving was that our audience, and it's one of the reasons why I really am quite committed to sort of looking at the intricacies of, online aesthetics, is in Australia, for example, 10% of the population live with a disability. None of that 10% can get to a live performance before the pandemic. Most of that 10%, not all of them, but most of that 10% can actually join one of our online projects. And if you work out a way to make it engaging and enthralling, and for them to be like any other audience member, to engage in the process. I mean, one of the great revelations was we worked with a disability justice activist in the States, and Alice was completely changed the way that we thought about an audience. And one of the great things about being online is that you can get access to very many people who have never had access to you before. And that flattens things, it basically flattens those hierarchical structures that have determined, all the kind of the politics that we're now kind of facing around, identity, and, those things actually become much more, they don't disappear, but they actually become exposed, and people are able to participate and contribute on a much more equal playing field. And that's what I love about the possibility that we have. And if you use the sort of the ethics of, live performance, and I think in live performance, we tested our ethics many, many times. If you use the ethics in those spaces and bring them to bear in these sort of, dual dimensions of live and online, so that they talk to each other, then the possibilities of creating a revolution are much greater.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying about the flattening and the reworking of comfort zones, right? The defaults, in a way, because the default tends to make one hold on a little bit more tightly perhaps than one should. And yet at the same time, recognizing the wealth of what is already there. It's not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but in a way, find the connections in the literacies, in the understanding, in the working principles that are at hand. But one is adaptability, which is a word that Janet used quite a lot in her keynote. The need to find that adaptive capacity or that adaptive intelligence and rework the narrative as well, I think is what emerges quite a lot in what you're saying. So that I guess the question is rather than so that the question is then, what's urgent almost? What becomes the thing that should or could potentially create the disruption because of a sense of urgency that is compelling and a sense of conviction. And I think that's a collaborative thing. I don't expect it to be an answer that comes from one person in one moment, but really all the different pieces that come together in that way. Questions, thoughts, responses that emerge from this very rich range of possibilities that are coming up here. Hao Nian, yeah?
Yes, just want to harp back on one term that was used and it struck me that we actually don't really discuss it as dramaturgs a lot, or talk about it anyway. the idea of internal logic. I think that's something that it's we should talk about it, because it's actually in all our work, and with the e-zines, it's made material, the idea of the internal logic of the e-zines. As a thought, I would really like to see this publication of ADN having its own internal logic, hence its own operating system actually. And this operating system should be in its all its glory of overlapping, dense, messy, even, to use that word that Mariam was saying. But this internal logic is to me very interesting, because I find that the last few times that I have been trying to dramaturg online, that was my fallback question. What is the internal logic of this project I'm doing? Simply because I could not be there physically to be in the space of the performance process or the performance making process. I had to literally think very hard how to actually materialize what I'm actually seeing as abstract, if you know what I mean. Imagine you're watching rehearsal on screen, right? And as dramaturg, and then in your head, you have to go, no, this is a live performance. And then the parameters of what's required of a live performance kicks in, but not quite, because I'm not physically feeling it. So one of my sensorial experiences are cut. And then I have to rely on this internal logic of then just working out the performance, where there is an internal logic that would reveal itself to the audience actually. And I'm posing this as a question actually to both David and Janet. How do we actually tap into accessing internal logics of your operating systems and the systems that you've been talking about, Janet? You've written a whole book about cultural mapping, which to me is actually then you accessing a kind of internal logic about cultural mapping, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you mean by internal logic, because this is a kind of an area which is also of interest to me, because I think that dramaturgy, for it to be successful, as David says, if we keep to the language of the arts and then move into neurology or health or politics or whatever, we still want to make our language known, and we want to see it from our logic. But once you have an interface with a neurologist, he is using a completely different logic. It's like dancers who want to use technology, or they want to co-collaborate with technology when they're choreographing, without understanding that it's a completely different logic. It's not in opposition, it's just another type of logic. So if we don't understand that logic, and cultural mapping taught me that every culture or every place has its own logic, and if we want to work in that interface, then, like, if we want to work with politics, we have to understand the logic of politics. If we want to work with brain scientists, we have to understand and that's that intersection between us and them is very important. That kind of exchange. I think through cultural mapping, I discovered that. But the other interesting point which I discovered, this different type of logic, is when we bring planners or architects and they interface with a vernacular user of the site. You see, they want to plan for the site, but actually the user has been there for generations. The logic is completely different, They're both, and it takes them some time before they kind of understand each other. and kind of, oh, let me get into your head and let me get into your head. And then, yeah, okay, now we can find a kind of a common ground for dialogue. And I think dramaturging that process of two types of logic coming together actually makes the work very deep. Helps this idea of intersectoral dramaturgy or interdisciplinary. If you want to call it I'm hoping and waiting for the day when it will be called trans rather than inter or cross.
Thank you, Shannon. Actually, that's exactly what I'm trying to get at, but not as articulately. The idea that different logics.
Yeah, and the journey is long, Hao Nian. I feel it's a long journey.
It is. It is. But within, say, a performance project, as opposed to rippling out to looking at what David was talking about, dramaturgy of the social and your work with the community, right? That's what I'm trying to get at, is that I think this thing about accessing internal logics, plural, with different disciplines, forms, paradigms, is something that it's a long process.
Yeah.
But within just a contained performance project, there is also the internal logic. And that's my approach in the last 1 year, actually, just sitting here by myself with the screen going, okay, what exactly is this internal logic of this artist? Why is he doing that? Because maybe it's about learning to cope with the resource of just having to not only watch rehearsals online, but to carry out Zoom conversations with the artists online, where we're limited to 2-hour blocks or something like that. And plus, we are no longer in a vacuum environment of a rehearsal studio.
But don't you think that's a journey? I mean, when I think about technology and how maybe theatre people or dancers, or, when we collaborated with visual artists who worked with technology, when we started, it was really decorative,
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, the technology was used in a decorative way, and then we couldn't understand what the hell they were doing, or what. So actually, the collaboration is not about us totally understanding technology.
Yeah.
Collaboration is actually understanding what is the logic of that, technology, and how do we work with that, that kind of logic, or someone who understands that logic. How do we work with that? I think it's something like what David, I don't know, David, whether when you import algorithmic patterns, that's what you're already beginning to do, I feel.
Yeah, it's so interesting that it's reminded me of a performance I directed, must be almost 30 years ago. It was sort of like a big opening event for the Melbourne International Festival, and it's like it was a big story for me. And on the preview, it was Titus Andronicus in 4 languages. Okay, the first time Wurundjeri was heard in public forum for 123 years. It was Vietnamese, Italian, English, and Wurundjeri. And on the preview, one of the actors broke their collarbone and couldn't go on. So I had to learn his role. He was speaking Italian, so I'm half Italian. So but I speak Italian very badly. But I had to go on the opening night, and I understood. It was such a brilliant thing for me to learn, because I directed the whole production, and I saw the internal logic of that production as a director. And when I went and acted as one of 12 actors, I understood that actor had his own internal logic throughout the whole performance. And then I understood, well, if I've got an internal logic, then there's 12 internal logics there just in the performance cast. And then the designer has it, and the costume designer has it. And it was a complete revelation. And then I sort of understood that it really depends on your point of view. As much
overlapping.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just want to highlight something Daniel's put on the chat, which he's taken from Janet's keynote, which is the artist as dramaturg frames an art project employing a dialogical dramaturgical process that is able to draw the community into social interaction and enable them to negotiate and co-create. Projects are designed to create new solidarities between migrants and locals, rural and urban, young and old. But I think the idea of this moving conflagration of different elements, different entities, different units that combine differently, like a shifting mosaic in a way. But nonetheless, there are certain inherent logics as well as disruptors of that logic, right? Because invariably that's also exciting in the process of an art logic, which we're saying is important, the imaginative, the fictional, the open-endedness and the non-prescriptiveness that make it compelling in a very sensuous way and allow for then the interface, let's say, with a neurologist or a nuclear scientist or marine biologist or a chef to then find the intersectional, the space, the in-between. I think it's something that is very propelling to think about these options, these opportunities and responsibilities as well. I now feel definitely a new kind of responsibility about this book, which I'm going to share with the team because it's certainly not all mine. But I really appreciate what has emerged as part of a kind of aspirational expression, but also digging into one's experience, the experience of ADN review and your reading of it, as well as the connections, the different dots, the different vectors that come together in different ways. I'm going to ask if there are comments from or questions from our, not audience, but co-participants at this point, before I ask David and Janet to kind of give us a final word, because I am aware of time. Yes, no, is there anyone? Yeah, Marion?
I just want to say, Charl, that question, what is urgent, is very disturbing.
Could you say more?
That's all I have to say about it.
You're not going to say more?
No, yeah. I'm like, fuck, what is urgent, you know? And then I have like 9 million things running through my head, and some are just so obvious and banal, and I don't know.
Okay.
I have nothing more to say.
I don't attempt to answer that question. Yeah.
No, it's just that it's really scary and important and heavy question that gives me palpitations.
I think what is most urgent is the principle and practice of care. I think if we maybe can start there, then we can make a different world to the one that is being proposed at us ad infinitum, and which sometimes doesn't look like the one I inhabit and sometimes does. But I think the principle and practice of care is the most urgent thing for me.
I'm just going to take off from where David said. I think in this era, and you know what Marion's fear, I mean, my fear is really about how we are dealing with this pandemic as humans and how we're actually causing it and just making it really huge, you know, through our own actions. And also climate change. For me, these are two very urgent things. The behavior of humans during a pandemic and the behavior of humans towards the issue of climate change. The kind of stands that, you know, the stand that we are taking towards it. And when I say we, I mean, government, states, everything. So yeah, so this statement on the caring, caring about the environment, caring about another human being in a social kind of manner. The kind of social responsibility or environmental responsibility is really the big human condition that I think dramaturgy or artists have to address in the future. How are they going to, how will our cultural ways of thinking and doing actually impact our own human condition? And how are we going to change it to one of caring? Can social or cultural dramaturgy actually help to do this?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that, Janet, because that was the first thing that came into my head was climate change.
Yeah.
That was the first thing. And I went, yeah.
And I think in order to do that, dramaturgy, to attend to the urgent issues, dramaturgy has to move towards the transdisciplinary, transcultural. I know a lot of the papers were on intercultural, cross-cultural, but actually these two urgent matters have moved us to a trans level, and we have to start looking beyond our own notions of culture.
Yeah. I think that's a good point at which to say there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of thinking to be done. There's a lot of caring to be done. And the space of shared reflection is so important. And this is what this has been for me. It's a conversation. It's the age of conversation. But it's also a space in which the interactions and the possibilities of thinking together. Thank you all for being here. Thank you very much, Janet and David, for your generosity and provocation, as well as your continued work that makes it possible for this conversation to happen. Thank you, Center 42, for making this happen as well, Yan Ling and the whole team. I know there's a wrap-up slide, which I'll come to in a minute, but I also want to say thank you very much to Daniel and Guaki, and I'm missing Dominic, but the editorial team that has made the conversation happen as well. With regards to what is ADN doing next, well, we've heard a little bit about the book. That's a long-term project. In the more immediate future, I'm going to hand over to Yan Ling to talk about what else is upcoming for ADN and for Center 42. Thank you very, very much, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you again soon, in person or on screen, whatever the case may be. Yan Ling, over to you.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, David, and thank you to the editors of ADN Review. It's been 6 months of actually just talking, thinking, writing, designing, and producing them, but it's definitely a lot more time before that even started with digesting the material. So a huge thank you to the whole team for birthing this project, and we look forward to the next phase where we talk about the book.